and Judith Mackay from Final Strategies. Please come on stage.
I invite Dr. Judith Mackay. Thank you very much. I'm going to speak specifically about women in this particular session. The first slide, please. On this first slide, you should be able to see at a glance the difference in prevalence between, the next slide, please. You can see at a glance from this slide the different patterns of smoking around the world. And you'll see that in Asia, we have a very high prevalence of male smoking compared to the Western countries. But the prevalence of smoking amongst women is still low. It's still 5%. But I think this should not give any rise to complacency at all, because there is evidence that young girls are now beginning to smoke in Asia. So we need to be very vigilant about this. Next, please. Around the world, globally, 9% of women smoke. That's about 200 million women, compared with 40% of men. Recent WHO surveys show that in many countries, girls are now smoking as much as boys. Smoking amongst women is increasing in some countries. And in some countries, as we've just heard, in South Asia, women are chewing tobacco. And annually, 1.5 million women die from tobacco, 75% of them in low and middle income countries. And perhaps really importantly, the tobacco industry. I cannot give a talk nowadays without mentioning the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry are certainly targeting women. And the picture that you see I took 30 years ago in Bali, where you can see that already there is a hand with nail varnish on it. The tobacco industry were after women as long ago as 30 years ago. Next. Poverty has a woman's face, and the reason it has a woman's face is that women make less money, they have less access to money, they participate less in the paid workforce, and they have more dependence on whom they have to spend money. So in this context, the question of smoking and poverty, tobacco use and poverty, has a particular and amplified impact upon women. Next. The tobacco industry complicates all of what we do, and all of these issues, I've highlighted one, but all of these have a particular impact upon women. They hijack the political process, the legislative process. Secondly, they exaggerate the economic importance of the industry. They certainly do that around Asia. Thirdly, they manipulate public opinion to gain the appearance of respectability. For example, in Indonesia, they contributed to the relief effort in the volcanic eruption in 2010. There with all their logos on their clothing, on their vans and so on. They're appearing respectable and gaining support. They fabricate support through front groups who you may not even imagine are being funded behind the scenes by the tobacco industry. They discredit the proven scientific and economic evidence, and more now, they don't attack individuals, but they certainly intimidate governments with litigation or threats of litigation, or indeed trade threats. And the argument has really now moved from health to economics. Next, please. So you'll see all the economic myths that we hear from the tobacco industry. That tobacco control will lead to job and business losses for farmers, factory workers, retailers, the hospitality industry, and so on. The creation of smoke-free areas, similarly, will cause grave economic disruption to restaurant owners. Tax bans will severely affect the advertising industry. And increasing tobacco taxes will harm the poor and increase illicit trade. Now, anybody who is a health economist knows only too well that none of these arguments, not one of them, is absolutely true at all. But the problem is that governments hear these arguments from the tobacco industry. They often, to the extent that these mistaken economic arguments are the major obstacle to tobacco control in many countries. The next slide, please. So all of us involved in tobacco control have to become amateur economists. We have to understand the economic rebuttal to these arguments and know what the true cost of smoking is, particularly to women, but to the whole society. And of course, the most obvious are the immense healthcare costs caused by smoking, which now in fact is 6% of global spending on health. But perhaps even more concerning to the individual is this diversion of family income, which we've heard a lot about this morning. The use of money to buy cigarettes instead of buying, for example, food for children or education for children. But there's many more economic effects. There's the loss of labour productivity, time off to smoke, higher absence rates, loss of skilled workers by death, increased early retirement. The fires caused by careless smoking, a third of all the fires in the world are caused by careless smoking, damage to building fabric, the litter of billions of ends of cigarettes and matches and lighters, environmental degradation, and then there is the less certain cost in terms of organising it and understanding it, is the cost of human suffering. So all of these are massive costs. And the tobacco industry pays none of them. They sell their cigarettes and they get profit, but it's the people and it's the government, it's civil society that suffers, particularly women. Next. There is therefore a particular need for women to be involved in the decision-making process, because the problem is that unless women are involved with policy at a high level, that the needs of women, in fact, may be well overlooked. And the issues and needs of women may be overlooked if they are not in these positions. They may be considered only primarily in their family role, and that is a big mistake in tobacco control. They may be even considered with children, women and children, are sort of put together in one category, which is totally inappropriate, because the needs of children and the needs of women are quite different. And even data. The Framework Convention on Tobacco Control is sex disaggregating all its data and reporting. But again, it always needs to be reminded at every level that this needs to be done. And one nice little story is that in not the APAC conference, but in the World Conference in Beijing in 1997, China asked me, would I help them organize it? I said I would do so on the conditions of gender equity. And that meant in practice, explaining it to the government in China, that meant that half of all our chairs, half of all our plenary speakers, half of all our committees, and if people applied for funding to come from a low-income country, and more than one person was put forward, one of them had to be a woman. China said to me, A, that's not fair. No conference before that has had to do this. But secondly, we can't do it. It's too difficult. We don't even recognize what is a female name from Norway or somewhere like that. I said, it is possible and we will do it, and we did. And it made a massive difference to the tobacco conferences, the World Tobacco Conferences, and has now become enmeshed. And as I said, even from the topic to the atmosphere, everything has changed dramatically with the World Conferences since women were empowered and were present and were up on the stage. Next. So in conclusion, the key messages are that smoking rates are still very low amongst women in Asia in particular, but there is no grounds for complacency. Secondly, tobacco drives families into poverty with a particular effect upon women. Thirdly, women need to be in these leadership positions in decision-making policies at conferences, or they may be overlooked. And fifthly, the Sustainable Development Goals, both the Sustainable Development Goals and, as you can see here, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, in both of these conventions is enshrined the need for gender-specific equity and to consider the gender risks as far as women are concerned. Thank you.